a matter of time. Is there no remedy? None, sire, unless it be instantly administered. Charles compelled the wretched man to write in the fatal volume, "This book was given by me to the Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici, and then dismissed him." Henry, at his own prayer and for his personal safety, was confined in the prison of Vincennes by the king's order. Charles grew worse, and the physicians discussed his malady without daring to guess at the truth. Then Catherine came one day and explained to the king the cause of his disease. "Listen, my son, you believe in magic." "Oh, fully," said Charles, repressing his smile of incredulity. "Well," continued Catherine, "all your sufferings proceed from magic. An enemy afraid to attack you openly has done so in secret. A terrible conspiracy has been directed against your Majesty. You doubt it, perhaps, but I know it for a certainty." "I never doubt what you tell me," replied the king sarcastically. "I am curious to know how they have sought to kill me." "By magic. Look here." The queen drew from under her mantle a figure of yellow wax about 10 inches high, wearing a robe covered with golden stars, and over this a royal mantle. "See, it has on its head a crown," said Catherine, "and there is a needle in its heart. Now do you recognize yourself?" "Myself?" "Yes, in your royal robes, with the crown on your head." "And who made this figure?" asked the king, weary of the wretched farce. "The King of Navarre, of course." "No, sire, he did not actually make it, but it was found in the rooms of M. de la Mole, who serves the King of Navarre." "So, then, the person who seeks to kill me is M. de la Mole," said Charles. "He is only the instrument, and behind the instrument is the hand that directs it," replied Catherine. "This, then, is the cause of my illness. And now what must I do, for I know nothing of sorcery?" "The death of the conspirator destroys the charm. Its power ends with his life. You are convinced now, are you not, of the cause of your illness?" "Oh, certainly," Charles answered ironically. "And I am to punish M. de la Mole, as you say he is the guilty party?" "I say he is the instrument," and muttered Catherine, "we have infallible means for making him confess the name of his principal." Catherine left hurriedly without understanding the sardonic laughter of the king, and as she went out Marguerite appeared. "Oh, sire, sire," cried Marguerite, "you know what she says is false. It is terrible to accuse anyone's own mother, but she only lives to persecute the man who is devoted to you, Henry, your Henry, and I swear to you that what she says is false." "I think so, too, Margot. But Henry is safe. Safer in disgrace in Vincennes than in favor at the Louvre." "Oh, thanks, thanks. But there is another person in whose welfare I am interested, whom I hardly dare mention to my brother, much less to my king. M. de la Mole, is it not? But do you know that a figure dressed in royal robes and pierced to the heart was found in his rooms?" "I know it, but it was the figure of a woman, not of a man." "And the needle?" "Was a charm not to kill a man, but to make a woman love him." What was the name of this woman? Marguerite, cried the queen, throwing herself down and bathing the king's hand in her tears. Margot, what if I know the real author of the crime? For a crime has been committed, and I have not 3 months to live. I am poisoned, but it must be thought I die by magic. You know who is guilty? Yes, but it must be kept from the world, and so it must be believed I die of magic, and by the agency of him they accuse. But it is monstrous, exclaimed Marguerite. You know he is innocent. Pardon him, pardon him. I know it, but the world must believe him guilty. Let your friend die. His death alone can save the honor of our family. I am dying that the secret may be preserved. M. de la Mole, after enduring excruciating tortures at the hand of Catherine, without making any admissions, died on the scaffold. For the Bourbon shall not reign. Before he died, Charles showed Catherine the poisoned book, which he had kept under lock and key. And now burn it, madam. I read this book too much, so fond was I of the chase. And the world must not know the weaknesses of kings. When it is burnt, please summon my brother Henry. I wish to speak to him about the regency. Catherine brought Henry of Navarre to the king, and warned him that if he accepted the regency he was a dead man. Charles, however, though on his deathbed, declared Henry should be regent. Madam, he said, addressing his mother, if I had a son he would be king, and you would be regent. In your stead, did you decline, the King of Poland would be regent, and in his stead, dear Lincoln. But I have no son, and therefore the throne belongs to d'Anjou, who is absent. To make dear Lincoln regent is to invite civil war. I have therefore chosen the fittest person for regent. Salute him, madam, salute him, dear Lincoln. It is the King of Navarre. Never, cried Catherine, shall my race yield to a foreign one. Never shall a Bourbon reign while a Valois lives. She left the room, followed by dear Lincoln. Henry, said Charles, after my death you will be great and powerful. D'Anjou will not leave Poland, they will not let him. Dear Lincoln is a traitor. You alone are capable of governing. It is not the regency only, but the throne I give you. A stream of blood choked his speech. The fatal moment is come, said Henry. Am I to reign, or to live? Live, sire, a voice answered, and Renée appeared. The Queen has sent me to ruin you, but I have faith in your star. It is foretold that you shall be king. Do you know that the King of Poland will be here very soon? He has been summoned by the Queen. A messenger has come from Warsaw. You shall be king, but not yet. What shall I do, then? Fly instantly to where your friends wait for you. Henry stooped and kissed his brother's forehead, then disappeared down a secret passage, passed through the postern, and, springing on his horse, galloped off. He flies. The King of Navarre flies, cried the sentinels. Fire on him. Fire, said the Queen. The sentinels leveled their pieces, but the king was out of reach. "He flies," muttered dear Lincoln. "I am king, then." At the same moment the drawbridge was hastily lowered, and Henry d'Anjou galloped into the court, followed by 4 knights, crying, "France! France!" "My son," cried Catherine joyfully. "Am I too late?" said d'Anjou. "No. You are just in time. Listen." The captain of the king's guards appeared at the balcony of the king's apartment. He broke the wand he held in 2 places, and holding a piece in either hand, called out 3 times, "King Charles IX is dead! King Charles IX is dead! King Charles IX is dead!" "Charles IX is dead," said Catherine, crossing herself. "God save Henry III!" All repeated the cry. "I have conquered," said Catherine, "and the odious Bourbon shall not reign." The Black Tulip, published in 1850, was the last of Alexandre Dumas' more famous stories, and ranks deservedly high among the short novels of its prolific author. Dumas visited Holland in May 1849, in order to be present at the coronation of William III. At Amsterdam, and according to Flotow, the composer, it was the king himself who told Dumas the story of the Black Tulip and mentioned that none of the author's romances were concerned with the Dutch. Dumas, however, never gave any credit to this anecdote, and others have alleged that Paul Lacroix, the bibliophile, who was assisting Dumas with his novels at that time, is responsible for the plot. The question can never be answered, for who can disentangle the work of Dumas from that of his army of helpers? A feature of the Black Tulip is that in it is the bulb, and not a human being, that is the real center of interest. The fate of the bulb is made of first importance, and the fortunes of Cornelius van Bael, the tulip fancier, of Boxtel, and of Rosa, the gaoler's daughter, exciting though they are, take second place. I mob vengeance on the 20th of August, 1672. The city of The Hague was crowded in every street with a mob of people, all armed with knives, muskets, or sticks, and all hurrying towards the Buitenhof. Within that terrible prison was Cornelius de Witt, brother of John de Witt, the ex-Grand Pensionary of Holland. These brothers de Witt had long served the United Provinces of the Dutch Republic, and the people had grown tired of the Republic, and wanted William, Prince of Orange, for stadtholder. John de Witt had signed the act re-establishing the stadtholderate, but Cornelius had only signed it under the compulsion of an Orange mob that attacked his house at Dordrecht. This was the first count against the de Witts, their objection to a stadtholder. The second count was that the de Witts had always done their best to keep at peace with France. They knew that war with France meant ruin to Holland, but the more violent Orangists still believed that such a war would bring honor to the Dutch. Hence the popular hatred against the de Witts. A miscreant named Tikele fanned the flame against Cornelius by declaring that he had bribed him to assassinate William, the newly elected stadtholder. Cornelius was arrested, brought to trial, and tortured on the rack, but no confession of guilt could be wrung from the innocent, high-souled man. Then the judges acquitted Tikele, deprived Cornelius of all his offices, and passed sentence of banishment. John de Witt had already resigned the office of Grand Pensionary. On the 20th of August, Cornelius was to leave his prison for exile, and a fierce Orangist populace, incited to violence by the harangues of Tikele, was rushing to the Buitenhof prepared to do murder, and fearful lest the prisoner should escape alive. "To the gaol! To the gaol!" yelled the mob. But outside the prison was a line of cavalry drawn up under the command of Captain Tilly with orders to guard the Buitenhof, and while the populace stood in hesitation, not daring to attack the soldiers, John de Witt had quietly driven up to the prison, and had been admitted by the gaoler. The shouts and clamor of the people could be heard within the prison as John de Witt, accompanied by Griffiths the gaoler, made his way to his brother's cell. Cornelius learned there was no time to be lost, but there was a question of certain correspondence between John de Witt and M. de Louvois of France to be discussed. These letters, entirely creditable though they were to the statesmanship of the Grand Pensionary, would have been accepted as evidence of treason by the maddened Orangists, and Cornelius, instead of burning them, had left them in the keeping of his godson, Van Bael, a quiet, scholarly young man of Dordrecht, who was utterly unaware of the nature of the packet. "They will kill us if these papers are found," said John de Witt, and opening the window, they heard the mob shouting, "Death to traitors!" In spite of fingers and wrists broken by the rack, Cornelius managed to write a note. "Dear godson, burn the packet I gave you, burn without opening or looking at it, so that you may not know the contents. The secrets it contains bring death. Burn it, and you will have saved both John and Cornelius. Farewell, from your affectionate Cornelius de Witt." Then a letter was given to Craik, John de Witt's faithful servant, who at once set off for Dordrecht, and within a few minutes the two brothers were driving away to the city gate. Rosa, the gaoler's daughter, unknown to her father, had opened the postern, and had herself bidden de Witt's coachman drive round to the rear of the prison, and by this means the fury of the mob was, for the moment, evaded. And now the clamor of the Orangists was at the prison door, for Tilly's horse had withdrawn on an order signed by the deputies in the town hall, and the people were raging to get within the Buitenhof. The mob burst open the great gate, and yelling, "Death to the traitors! To the gallows with Cornelius de Witt!" poured in, only to find the prisoner had escaped. But the escape was but from the prison, for the city gate was locked when the carriage of the de Witts drove up, locked by order of the deputies of the town hall, and a certain young man who was none other than William, Prince of Orange, held the key. Before another gate could be reached, the mob, streaming from the Buitenhof, had overtaken the carriage, and the de Witts were at its mercy. The two men, whose lives had been spent in the welfare of their country, were massacred with unspeakable savagery, and their bodies, stripped, and hacked almost beyond recognition, were then strung up on a hastily erected gibbet in the market-place. When the worst had been done, the young man, who had secretly watched the proceedings from the window of a neighboring house, returned the key to the gatekeeper. Then the prince mounted a horse which an equerry held in waiting for him, and galloped off to camp to await the message of the States. He galloped proudly, for the burghers of The Hague had made of the corpses of the De Witts a stepping stone to power for William of Orange. Too betrayed for his bulbs, Dr. Cornelius van Bael, the godson of Cornelius de Witt, was in his 28th year, an orphan, but nevertheless, a really happy man. His father had amassed a fortune of 400,000 guilders in trade with the Indies, and an estate brought him in 10,000 guilders a year. He was blessed with the love of a peaceful life with good nerves, ample wealth, and a philosophic mind. Left alone in the big house at Dordrecht, he steadily resisted all temptations to public life. He took up the study of botany, and then, not knowing what to do with his time and money, decided to go in for one of the most extravagant hobbies of the time, the cultivation of his favorite flower, the tulip. The fame of Mynheer van Bael's tulips soon spread in the district, and while Cornelius de Witt had roused deadly hatred by sowing the seeds of political passion, Van Bael with his tulips won general goodwill. Yet, all unknowingly, Van Bael had made an enemy, an implacable, relentless enemy. This was his neighbor, Isaac Boxtel, who lived next door to him in Dordrecht. Boxtel, from childhood, had been a passionate tulip grower. He had even produced a tulip of his own, and the Boxtel had won wide admiration. One day, to his horror, Boxtel discovered that his next-door neighbor, the wealthy Mynheer van Bael, was also a tulip grower. In bitter anguish, Boxtel foresaw that he had a rival who, with all the resources at his command, might equal and possibly surpass the famous Boxtel creations. He almost choked with envy, and from the moment of his discovery lived under continual fear. The healthy pastime of tulip growing became, under these conditions, a morbid and evil occupation for Boxtel, while Van Bael, on the other hand, totally unaware of the enmity brewing, threw himself into the business with the keenest zest, taking for his motto the old aphorism, "To despise flowers is to insult God." So fierce was the envy that seized Boxtel that though he would have shrunk from the infamy of destroying a tulip, he would have killed the man who grew them. His own plants were neglected, it was useless and hopeless to contend against so wealthy a rival. Then Boxtel, fascinated by his evil passion, bought a telescope, and, perched on a ladder, studied Van Bael's tulip beds and the drying room, the tulip grower's sacred place. One night he lost all moral control, and tying the hind legs of two cats together with a piece of string, he flung the animals into Van Bael's garden. To Boxtel's bitter mortification, the cats, though they made havoc of many precious plants before they broke the string, left the 4 finest tulips untouched. Shortly afterwards the Haarlem Tulip Society offered a prize of 100,000 guilders to whomsoever should produce a large black tulip, without spot or blemish. Van Bael at once thought out the idea of the black tulip. He had already achieved a dark brown one, while Boxtel, who had only managed to produce a light brown one, gave up the quest as impossible, and could do nothing but spy on his neighbor's activities. One evening in January 1672, Cornelius de Witt came to see his grandson, Cornelius van Baerle, and went with him alone into the sacred drying room, the laboratory of the tulip grower. Boxtel, with his telescope, recognized the well-known features of the statesman, and presently he saw him hand his godson a packet, which the latter put carefully away in a cabinet. This packet contained the correspondence of John de Witt and M. de Louvois. Cornelius drove away, and Boxtel wondered what the packet contained. It could hardly be bulbs, it must be secret papers. It was not till August, as we know, that Craik was dispatched to Van Baerle with the note bidding him destroy the packet. Craik arrived just when Van Baerle was nursing his precious bulbs, the bulbs of the black tulip, and his sudden entrance rudely disturbed the tulip grower. He had not time to read the note, indeed, he was too much concerned with the welfare of his 3 particular bulbs to trouble about it, before a magistrate and some soldiers entered to arrest him. Van Baerle wrapped up the bulbs in the note from his godfather, and was sent off under close custody to The Hague. The magistrate carried off the packet from the cabinet. All this was Boxtel's work. It was he who had reported to the magistrate the visit of de Witt and the placing of the packet in a cabinet. And now, with Van Baerle out of the house as a prisoner, Boxtel in the dead of night broke into his neighbor's house, to secure the priceless bulbs of the black tulip. He had made out where they were growing, and he plunged his hands into the soft soil only to find nothing. Then the wretched man guessed that the bulbs had gone with the prisoner to The Hague, and decided to go in pursuit. Van Baerle could only keep them while he was alive, and then they should be his, Isaac Boxtel's. 3. The theft of the tulip. Van Baerle was placed in the cell occupied by Cornelius de Witt in the Buitenhof. Outside, in the market-place, the bodies of the de Witts were hanging, and Van Baerle read with horror the inscription, "Here hang that great rascal John de Witt and the little rascal Cornelius de Witt, enemies of their country." Griffiths laughed when the prisoner asked him what it meant, and replied, "That's what happens to those that write secret letters to the enemies of the Prince of Orange." A terrible despair fell on Van Baerle, but he refused to escape when Rosa, the gaoler's beautiful daughter, suggested it to him. He was brought to trial, and though he denied all knowledge of the correspondence, his goods were confiscated, and he was condemned to death. He bequeathed his 3 tulip bulbs to Rosa, explained how she must get a certain soil from Dordrecht, and went out calmly to die. On the scaffold Van Baerle was reprieved and sentenced to perpetual imprisonment, for the Prince of Orange shrank from further bloodshed. One spectator in the crowd was bitterly disappointed. This was Boxtel, who had bribed the headsman to let him have Van Baerle's clothes, believing that he would thus obtain the priceless bulbs. Van Baerle was sent to the prison of Loewenstein, and in February 1673, when he was thinking his tulips lost forever, he heard Rosa's voice. Griffiths had applied for the gaolership of Loewenstein, and had been appointed. Nothing could persuade him that if Van Bael was not a traitor he was certainly in league with the devil, like all learned men, and he did all he could to mortify and annoy his prisoner. But Rosa would come every night when her father, stupefied by gin, was asleep, and talk to Cornelius through the barred grating of his cell door. He taught her to read, and together they planned how the tulip bulbs should be brought to flower. One bulb Rosa was to plant, the second Van Bael would cultivate in his cell with soil placed in an old water jug, and the third was to be kept in reserve. Once more hope revived in Bael's mind, but Rosa often suffered vexation because Cornelius thought more of his black tulip than of her. In the meantime Boxtel, under the assumed name of Jacob Geisels, had made his way to Loewenstein in pursuit of the bulbs, and had ingratiated himself with Griffiths, offering to marry his daughter. Rosa's tulip had to be guarded from Geisels, who was always spying on her movements. She kept it in her room for safety, but Boxtel had a key made, and the day the tulip flowered, and arose a spotless black, he resolved to take it at once, and rush to Haarlem and claim the prize. The day came. Rosa described to Cornelius the wonderful black tulip, and they drew up a letter to the president of the Horticultural Society at Haarlem, begging him to come and fetch the wonderful flower. That very night, while Cornelius and Rosa rejoiced as lovers, for now even Rosa was convinced of the prisoner's love for her over the happiness of the flowering tulip, Boxtel crept into her room, and carried off the black tulip to Haarlem. As for Van Bael, he was beside himself with the rage of desperation when Rosa told him that the black tulip had been stolen. Rosa, bent on recovering the tulip, and certain in her own mind as to the thief, hastened away from Loewenstein the next day without a word. Griffiths was mad when he learnt his daughter was nowhere to be found, and put down the mysterious disappearance of Jacob Geisels and Rosa to the work of the devil, and was convinced that Van Bael was the devil's agent. The third day after the theft, Griffiths, armed with a stick and a knife, attacked Cornelius, calling out, "Give me back my daughter." Cornelius got hold of the stick, forced Griffiths to drop the knife, and then proceeded to give the gaoler a thrashing. The noise brought in turnkeys and guards, who speedily carried off the wounded gaoler and arrested Van Bael. To comfort the prisoner they assured him he would certainly be shot within 12 hours. Then an officer, an aide-de-camp of the Prince of Orange, entered, escorted Van Bael to the prison gate, and bade him enter a carriage. Believing himself about to die, he thought sadly of Rosa and of the tulip he was never to see again. The carriage rolled off, and they travelled all that day and night until the journey ended at Haarlem. For the triumph of the tulip, Rosa reached Haarlem just 4 hours after Boxtel's arrival, and she went at once to seek an interview with Mynheer van Sistens, the president of the Horticultural Society. Immediate admittance was granted on her mentioning the magic words "black tulip." "Sir, the black tulip has been stolen from me," said Rosa. "But I only saw it 2 hours ago," replied the president. "You saw it where?" "Why, at your master's." "Are you not in the service of Mynheer Isaac Boxtel?" "Aye, sir." Certainly not. But this Isaac Boxtel, is he a thin, bald-headed, bow-legged, crook-backed, haggard-looking man? You have described him exactly. He is the thief, he stole the black tulip from me. Well, go and find Mynheer Boxtel, he is at the White Swan Inn, and settle it with him. And with that the president took up his pen and went on writing, for he was busy over his report. But Rosa still implored him, and while she was speaking the Prince of Orange entered the building. Rosa told everything, how she had received the bulb from the prisoner at Loewenstein, and how she had first seen the prisoner at The Hague. Then Boxtel was sent for. He was ready with his tale. The girl had plotted with her lover, the state prisoner, Cornelius van Bael, and had stolen his Boxtel's black tulip, which he had unwisely mentioned. However, he had recovered it. A thought struck Rosa. There were 3 bulbs. What has become of the others? She asked. One failed, the second produced the black tulip, and the third is at home at Dordrecht, said Boxtel uneasily. You lie, it is here, cried Rosa. And she drew from her bosom the 3rd bulb, still wrapped in the same paper Van Bael had so hastily put round the bulbs on his flight. Take it, my lord, she said, handing it to the prince. And then, glancing at the paper for the first time, she added, Oh, my lord, read this. William passed the 3rd bulb to the president, and read the paper carefully. It was Cornelius de Witt's letter to his godson, exhorting him to burn the packet without opening it. It was the proof of Van Bael's innocence and of his ownership of the bulbs. Go, Mynheer Boxtel, you shall have justice. And you, Mynheer van Sistens, take care of this maiden and of the tulips, said the prince. That same evening the prince summoned Rosa to the town hall, and talked to her. Rosa did not deny her love for Cornelius. But what is the good of loving a man condemned to live and die in prison? The prince asked. I can help him to live and die, came the answer. The prince sealed a letter, and sent it off to Loewenstein by Colonel van Dicken. Then he turned to Rosa, and said, The day after tomorrow is Sunday, and it will be the festival of the tulip. Take these 500 guilders, and dress yourself in the costume of a Friesland bride, for I want it to be a grand festival for you. Sunday came, the 15th of May, 1673, and all Haarlem gathered to do honor to the black tulip. Boxtel was in the crowd, feasting his eyes on the sacred flower, which was borne aloft in a litter. The procession stopped, and the flower was placed on a pedestal, while the people cheered with wild enthusiasm. At the solemn moment when the Prince of Orange was to acclaim the triumphant owner of the black tulip and present the prize of 100,000 guilders, the coach with the unhappy prisoner Cornelius van Bael drew up in the market-place. Cornelius, hearing that the celebration of the black tulip was actually proceeding, besought his guard to let him have one glimpse of the flower, and the petition was granted by the Prince of Orange. From a distance of 6 paces Van Bael gazed at the black tulip, and then he, with the multitude, turned his eyes towards the prince, In dead silence the prince declared the occasion of the festival, the discovery of the wonderful black tulip, and concluded, "Let the owner of the black tulip approach." Cornelius made an involuntary movement. Boxtel and Rosa rushed forward from the crowd. The prince turned to Rosa. "This tulip is yours, is it not?" he said. "Yes, my lord," she answered softly. And general applause came from the crowd. "This tulip will henceforth bear the name of its producer, and will be called Tulipa nigra rosa baertensis, because Van Bael is to be the married name of this damsel," the prince announced, and at the same time he took Rosa's hand and placed it within the hand of the prisoner, who had rushed forward at the words he had heard. Boxtel fell down in a fit, and when they raised him up he was dead. The procession returned to the town hall. The prince declared Rosa the prize winner, and informed Cornelius that, having been wrongfully condemned, his property was restored to him. Then he entered his coach, and was driven away. Cornelius and Rosa departed for Dordrecht, and Van Bael remained ever faithful to his wife and his tulips. As for old Griffiths, after being the roughest gaoler of men, he lived to be the fiercest guardian of tulips at Dordrecht. The Corsican Brothers is one of the most famous of Dumas' shorter stories. It was published in 1845, when the author was at the height of his powers, and is remarkable not only for its strong dramatic interest, but for its famous account of old Corsican manners and customs, being inspired by a visit to Corsica in 1834. The scenery of the island, and the life of the inhabitants, the survival of the vendetta, and the fierce family feuds, all made strong appeal to his imaginative mind. Several versions of the story have been dramatized for the English stage, and as a play The Corsican Brothers has enjoyed a long popularity, but Dumas himself, who was fond of adapting his works to the stage, never dramatized this story. The twins. I was traveling in Corsica early in March 1841. Corsica is a French department, but it is by no means French, and Italian is the language commonly spoken. It is free from robbers, but it is still the land of the vendetta, and the province of Sartène, wherein I was traveling, is the home of family feuds, which last for years and are always accompanied by loss of life. I was traveling alone across the island, but I had been obliged to take a guide, and when at 5 o'clock we halted on a hill overlooking the village of Sullacro, my guide asked me where I would like to stay for the night. There were, perhaps, 120 houses in Sullacro for me to choose from, so after looking out carefully for the one that promised the most comfort, I decided in favor of a strong, fortified, squarely built house. "Certainly," said my guide. "That is the house of Madame Savilia de Franchi. Your honor has chosen wisely." I was a little uncertain whether it was quite the right thing for me to seek hospitality at a house belonging to a lady, for, being only 36, I considered myself a young man. But I found it quite impossible to make my guide understand my feelings. The notion that my staying a night could give occasion for gossip concerning my hostess, or that it made any difference whether I was old or young, was unintelligible to a Corsican. Madame Savillia, I learned from the guide, was about 40, and had 2 sons, twins 21 years old. One lived with his mother, and was a Corsican, the other was in Paris, preparing to be a lawyer. We soon arrived at the house we sought. My guide knocked vigorously at the door, which was promptly opened by a man in velvet waistcoat and breeches and leather gaiters. I explained that I sought hospitality, and was answered in return that the house was honored by my request. My luggage was carried off, and I entered. In the corridor a beautiful woman, tall, and dressed in black, met me. She bade me welcome, and promised me that of her son, telling me that the house was at my service. A maid-servant was called to conduct me to the room of M. Louis, and as supper would be served in an hour, I went upstairs. My room was evidently that of the absent son, and the most comfortable in the house. Its furniture was all modern, and there was a well-filled bookcase. I hastily looked at the volumes. They denoted a student of liberal mind. A few minutes later, and my host, M. Lucien de Franchi, entered. I observed that he was young, of sunburnt complexion, well-made, and fearless and resolute in his bearing. "I am anxious to see that you have all you need," he said, "for we Corsicans are still savages, and this old hospitality, which is almost the only tradition of our forefathers left, has its shortcomings for the French." I assured him that the apartment was far from suggesting savagery. "My brother Louis likes to live after the French fashion," Lucien answered. He went on to speak of his brother, for whom he had a profound affection. They had already been parted for 10 months, and it was 3 or 4 years before Louis was expected home. As for Lucien, nothing, he said, would make him leave Corsica. He belonged to the island, and could not live without its torrents, its rocks, and its forests. The physical resemblance between himself and his brother, he told me, was very great, but there was considerable difference of temperament. Having completed my own change of dress, I went into Lucien's room, at his suggestion. It was a regular armory, and all the furniture was at least 300 years old. While my host put on the dress of a mountaineer, for he mentioned to me that he had to attend a meeting after supper, he told me the history of some of the carbines and daggers that hung round the room. Of a truth, he came of an utterly fearless stock, to whom death was of small account by the side of courage and honor. At supper, Madame de Franchi could not help expressing her anxiety for her absent son. No letter had been received, but Lucien for days had been feeling wretched and depressed. "We are twins," he said simply, "and however greatly we are separated, we have one and the same body, as we had at our birth. When anything happens to one of us, be it physical or mental, it at once affects the other. I know that Louis is not dead, for I should have seen him again in that case." "You would have told me if he had come," said Madame de Franchi anxiously. "At the very moment, mother." I was amazed. Neither of them seemed to express the slightest doubt or surprise at this extraordinary statement. Lucian went on to regret the passing of the old customs of Corsica. His very brother had succumbed to the French spirit, and on his return would settle down as an advocate at Ajaccio, and probably prosecute men who killed their enemies in a vendetta. And I, too, am engaged in affairs unworthy of a de Franchi, he concluded. You have come to Corsica with curiosity about its inhabitants. If you care to set out with me after supper, I will show you a real bandit. I accepted the invitation with pleasure. To M. Luden de Franchi, Lucian explained to me the object of our expedition. For 10 years the village of Sulacro had been divided over the quarrel of two families, the Orlandi and the Colonna, a quarrel that had originated in the seizure of a poultry hen belonging to the Orlandi, which had flown into the poultry yard of the Colonnas. 9 people had already been killed in this feud, and now Lucian, as arbitrator, was to bring it to an end. The local prefect had written to Paris that one word from de Franchi would end the dispute, and Louis had appealed to him. Tonight Lucian was to arrange matters with Orlandi, as he had already done with Colonna, and the meeting place was at the ruins of the castle of Vicentello di Istria. It was a steep ascent, but we arrived in good time, and while we sat and waited, Lucian told me terrible stories of feuds and vengeance. Orlandi made his appearance exactly at 9 o'clock, and after some discussion agreed to Lucian's terms. I found that I was expected to act as surety for Orlandi, and accepted the responsibility. You will now be able to tell my brother, on your return to Paris, that it's all been settled as he wished, said Lucian. On our way home Lucian showed wonderful marksmanship with his gun, and admitted he was equally skillful with the pistol. His brother Louis, on the other hand, had never touched either gun or pistol. Next morning came the grand reconciliation of Orlandi and Colonna, in the market square in the presence of the mayor and the notary. The mayor compelled the belligerents to shake hands, a document was signed declaring the vendetta at an end, and everybody went to mass. Later in the day I was compelled to bid goodbye to Madame de Franchi and her son, and set out for Paris, but before I left Lucian told me how in his family his father had appeared to him on his deathbed, and that, not only at death, but at any great crisis in life, an apparition appeared. He was certain by his own depression that his brother Louis was suffering. Lucian told me his brother's address, 7, Rue du Helder, and gave me a letter which I undertook to deliver personally. We parted with great cordiality, and a week later I was back in Paris. 3. The fate of Louis I was startled by the extraordinary resemblance of M. Louis de Franchi, whom I had at once called upon, to his brother. I was relieved to find that he was not suffering from illness, and I told him of the anxiety of his family concerning his health. M. de Franchi replied that he had not been ill, but that he had been suffering from a very bitter disappointment, aggravated by the knowledge that his own suffering caused his brother to suffer, too. He hoped, however, that time would heal the wound in his heart. We agreed to meet the following night at the opera ball at midnight, on the young lawyer's suggestion. I rallied him on his recovery from his sorrow, but Louis only said mournfully that he was driven by fate, dragged against his will. "I am quite sure," he said, "that it would be better for me not to go, but nevertheless I am going." Louis was too preoccupied to talk when we met at the masked ball, and he suddenly left me for a lady carrying violets. Later he rejoined me, and together we set off to supper at 3 o'clock in the morning. It was my friend D's supper party, and he had included Louis in the invitation. We found our friends waiting supper, and D announced that the only person who had not arrived was Chateau Renaud. It seemed there was a wager on that M. de Chateau Renaud would not arrive with a certain lady whom he had undertaken to bring to supper. Louis, who was as pale as death, implored D not to mention the lady's name, and our host acceded to the request. "Only as her husband is at Smyrna, or in India or Mexico or somewhere, and in such a case it's the same as if the lady wasn't married," D observed. "I assure you her husband is coming back soon, and he is such a good fellow he would be horribly mortified to hear his wife had done anything silly in his absence." Chateau Renaud had till 4 o'clock to save his bet. At 5 minutes to 4 he had not arrived, and Louis smiled at me over his wine. At that very moment the bell rang. D went to the door, and we could hear some argument going on in the hall. Then a lady entered with obvious reluctance, escorted by D and Chateau Renaud. "It's not yet 4," said Chateau Renaud to D. "Quite right, my boy," the other answered. "You've won your bet." "No, hardly yet, sir," said the unknown lady. "Now I know why you were so persistent. You have wagered to bring me here to supper, and I supposed you were taking me to sup with one of my own friends." Both Chateau Renaud and D besought the lady to stay, but the fair unknown, after expressing her thanks to D for his welcome, turned to M. Louis de Franchi, and asked him to escort her home. Louis at once sprang forward. Chateau Renaud, furious, insisted that he would know whom to hold accountable. "If I am the person meant," said Louis, with great dignity, "you will find me at home at 7, Rue du Helder all day tomorrow." Louis departed with his fair companion, and though Chateau Renaud was ostentatiously cheerful, the end of the supper party was not at all a festive business. At 10 o'clock the same morning I arrived at the rooms of M. Louis de Franchi. The seconds of Chateau Renaud had already called, and I passed them on the stairs. Louis had written me a note, with another friend, Baron Giordano Martelli. The affair was to be arranged with Baron de Chateaugrand, and M. de Boissy, the gentleman I had met on the stairs. I looked at the cards of these two men, and asked Louis if the matter was of any great seriousness. Louis replied by telling the story of the quarrel. A friend of his, a sea captain, had married a beautiful woman, so beautiful and so young that Louis could not help falling in love with her. As an honorable man he had kept away from the house, and then on being reproached by his friend, had frankly told him the reason. In return, his friend, who was just setting off for Mexico, commended his wife, Emily, whom he adored and trusted absolutely, to his care, and asked his wife to consider Louis de Franchi as her brother. For 6 months the captain had been away, and Emily had been living at her mother's. To this house, among other visitors, had come M. de Chateaurenaud, and from the first, this typical man of the world had been an object of dislike to Louis. Emily's flirtations with Chateaurenaud at last provoked a remonstrance from Louis, and in return the lady told him that he was in love with her himself, and that he was absurd in his notions. After that Louis had left off calling on Emily, but gossip was soon busy with the lady's name. An anonymous letter had made an appointment for Louis with the Lady of the Violets at the masked ball, and from this person he was informed again not only of Emily's infidelity, but further, that M. de Chateaurenaud had wagered he would bring her to supper at D.S. The rest I knew, and I could only assent mournfully that things must go on, and that the proposals of Chateaurenaud's seconds could not be declined. But M. Louis de Franchi had never touched sword or pistol in his life. However, there was nothing for it but to return M. de Chateaugrand's call. Martelly and I found that Chateaurenaud's 2 supporters were both polite men of the world. They were as indifferent as Louis was to the choice of weapons, and by a spin of a coin it was decided that pistols were to be used. The place agreed upon for the duel was the Bois de Vincennes, and the time 9 o'clock the following morning. I called in the evening on Louis to ask him if he had any instructions for me, but his only reply was counsel comes with the night, so I waited on him next morning. He was just finishing a letter when I entered, and he bade his servant Joseph leave us undisturbed for 10 minutes. I am anxious, said Louis, that my friend Giordano Martelli, who is a Corsican, should not know of this letter. But you must promise to carry out my wishes, and then my family may be saved a second misfortune. Now, please read the letter. I read the letter Louis had written. It was to his mother, and it said that he was dying of brain fever. Her son, writing in a lucid interval, was beyond hope of recovery. It would be posted to her a quarter of an hour after his death. There was an affectionate postscript to Lucien. What does this mean? I don't understand it, I said. It means that at 10 minutes past 9 I shall be dead. I have been forewarned, that is all. My father appeared to me last night and announced my death. He spoke so simply of this visit, that if it was an illusion it was as terribly convincing as the truth. There is one thing more, said Louis. If my brother was to hear that I had been killed in a duel, he would at once leave Sullacro to come and fight the man who had killed me. And then if he were killed in his turn my mother would be thrice widowed. To prevent that I have written this letter. If it is believed that I have died of brain fever no one can be blamed. He paused. Unless but no, that must not be. I knew that my own strange fear was his. On the way to Vincennes Baron Giordano stopped to get a case of pistols, powder, and balls, and we arrived at our destination just as M. de Chateaurenaud's carriage drove up. At M. de Chateaugrand's suggestion we all made our way to a certain glade away from the public pathway. Martelli and Chateaugrand measured the distance together, while Louis bade me farewell, asking me to accept his watch, and begging me to keep the duel out of the papers, and to prevail upon Giordano not to let any word of the matter reach Sullacro. Chateau Renaud was at his post. Baron Giordano gave Louis his pistol. Chateaugrand called out, "Gentlemen, are you ready?" Then he clapped his hands. 1, 2, 3. 2 shots went off at the same moment, and Louis de Franchi fell. His opponent was unhurt. I rushed to Louis and raised him up. Blood came to his lips. It was useless to send for a surgeon. Chateau Renaud had withdrawn, but his seconds hastened to express their horror at the fatal ending of the combat. Chateaugrand added that he hoped M. de Franchi bore no malice against his opponent. "No, no, I forgive him," said Louis. "But tell him to leave Paris. He must go." The dying man spoke with difficulty. He reminded me of my promise, and asked me, as he fell back, to look at my watch. It was exactly 10 minutes past 9, and Louis was dead. We carried the body back to the house, and Giordano made the required statement to the district commissioner of police. Then the house was sealed by the police, and Louis de Franchi was laid to rest in Père Lachaise. But M. de Chateau Renaud could not be persuaded to leave Paris, though Millimetre de Boissy and de Chateaugrand both did their best to induce him to go. For Lucien takes vengeance. One night, 5 days after the funeral, I was working late at my writing table, when my servant entered, and told me in a frightened tone that M. de Franchi wanted to speak to me. "Who?" I said, in astonishment. "M. de Franchi, sir, your friend, the gentleman who has been here once or twice to see you." "You must be out of your senses, Victor. Don't you know that he died 5 days ago?" "Yes, sir, and that's why I am so upset. I heard a ring at the bell, and when I opened the door, he walked in, asked if you were at home, and told me to tell you that M. de Franchi desired to speak with you. Are you out of your mind, my good man? I suppose the hall is badly lit, and you were half asleep and heard the name wrong. Go back and ask the name again." "No, sir, I will swear that I'm not mistaken. I'm sure I heard and saw perfectly." "Very well, then, show him in." Victor went back to the door, trembling all the time, and said, "Please step in, sir." My hasty sensation of terror was quickly dispelled. It was Lucien who was apologizing to me for disturbing me at such an hour. "The fact is," he said, "I only arrived 10 minutes ago, and you will understand how impossible it was not to come and see you at once. I at once thought of the letter I had sent. In 5 days it could not have reached Sullacro." "Good heaven!" I cried. "Nothing is known to you." "Everything is known," he said quietly. Lucien mentioned that on going to his brother's house, the people were so panic-stricken that they refused the door to him. "Tell me," I said, when we were alone. "You must have been on your way here when you heard the fatal news." "On the contrary, I was at Sullacro." "Have you forgotten what I told you about the apparitions in my family?" "Has your brother appeared to you?" I cried. "Yes. He told me he had been killed in a duel by M. de Chateaurenaud. I saw my brother in his room the day he was killed," Lucien went on, "and that night in a dream I saw the place where the duel was fought, and heard the name of M. de Chateaurenaud. And I have come to Paris to kill the man who killed my brother." My brother had never touched a pistol in his life, and it was as easy to kill him as to kill a tame stag. My mother knows why I have come. She is a true Corsican, and she kissed me on the forehead and said go. The next morning Lucien wrote to Giordano and sent a challenge to Chateaurenaud. Then he went with me to Vincennes, and, though he had never been there in his life before, Lucien walked straight to the spot where his brother had fallen. He turned round, walked 20 paces, and said, "This is where the villain stood, and tomorrow he will lie here." Lucien predicted with absolute confidence the death of Chateaurenaud. The challenge was accepted, the same seconds acted, and on the morrow we assembled in the fatal glade. Chateaurenaud was obviously uneasy. The signal was given, both men fired, and, sure enough, Chateaurenaud fell, shot through the temple as Lucien had foretold. Then, for the first time since Louis' death, Lucien burst into tears. He dropped his pistol and threw himself into my arms. "My brother, my dear brother," he cried. The Count of Monte Cristo. The Count of Monte Cristo appeared in 1844, when Dumas had been writing plays and stories for 20 years, and at a period when he was most extraordinarily prolific. In that year, assisted by his staff of compilers and transcribers, he is said to have turned out something like 40 volumes. Monte Cristo first gave Dumas novels a worldwide audience. Its unflagging spirit, the endless surprises, and the air of reality which was cast over the most extravagant situations made the work worthy of the popularity it enjoyed in almost every country in the world. The island from which it takes its name is a barren rock rising 2,000 feet out of the sea a few miles south of Elba. Dumas attempted to emulate Scott, and built a Chasentio near Saint-Germain, which he called Monte Cristo, costing over $125,000. It was afterwards sold for a tenth of that sum to pay his debts. The Conspiracy of Envy. On the 28th of February 1815, the three-masted Pharaon arrived at Marseilles from Smyrna, commanded by the first mate, young Edmond Dantès, the captain having died on the voyage. He had left a package for the Maréchal Bertrand on the Isle of Elba, which Dantès had duly delivered, conversing with the exiled Emperor Napoleon himself. The shipowner, M. Morel, confirmed young Dantès in the command, and, overjoyed, he hastened to his father, and then to the village of the Catalans, near Marseilles, where the dark-eyed Mercedes, his betrothed, impatiently awaited him. But his good fortune excited envy. Danglars, the supercargo of the Pharaon, wanted the command for himself, and Fernand, the Catalan cousin of Mercedes, hated Dantès because he had won her heart. Fernand's jealousy so took possession of him that he fell in willingly with a scheme which the envious Danglars proposed. Making use of Dante's compromising visit to Elba, they addressed an anonymous denunciation to the Procureur du Roi, which, in this period of Bonapartist plots, was indeed a formidable matter. Caderus, a boon companion, was at first taken into their confidence, but as he came to think it a dangerous trick to play the young captain, he refused to take part in it. On the morrow the wedding feast took place, and at 2 o'clock Dantes, radiant with joy and happiness, prepared to accompany his bride to the Hôtel de Ville for the civil ceremony. But at that moment the measured tread of soldiery was heard on the stairs, and a magistrate presented himself, bearing an order for the arrest of Edmond Dantes. Resistance or remonstrance was useless, and Dantes suffered himself to be taken to Marseilles, where he was examined by the deputy procureur du Roi, M. de Villefort. To him, on demand, he recounted the story of his visit to Elba. "Ah," said Villefort, "if you have been culpable it was imprudence. Give up this letter you have brought from Elba, and go and rejoin your friends." "You have it already," cried Dantes. Villefort glanced at it, and sank into his seat, stupefied. It was addressed to M. Noirtier, a staunch Bonapartist. "Oh, if he knew the contents of this," murmured he, "and that Noirtier is father of Villefort, I am lost." He approached the fire, and cast the fatal letter in. "Sir," said he, "I shall detail you till this evening in the Palais de Justice. Should anyone else interrogate you, do not breathe a word of this letter." "I promise." It was Villefort who seemed to entreat, and the prisoner to reassure him. But the doom of Edmond Dantes was cast. Sacrificed to Villefort's ambition, he was lodged the same night in a dungeon of the gloomy fortress prison of the Château d'If, while Villefort posted to Paris to warn the king that the usurper Bonaparte was meditating a landing in France. Napoleon returned. There followed the 100 Days, and Louis XVIII again mounted the throne. M. Morel's intercessions during Napoleon's brief triumph for the release of Dantes but served, on the restoration of Louis, to compromise further the unhappy prisoner, who languished in a foul prison in the depths of the Château d'If. In the cell next to Dantes was another political prisoner, the Abbé Faria. He had been in the chateau 4 years when Dantes was immured, and, with marvelously contrived tools and incredible toil, had burrowed a tunnel through the rock 50 feet long, only to find that, instead of leading to the outer wall of the chateau, whence he could have flung himself into the sea, it led to the cell of another prisoner Dantes. He penetrated it after Dantes had been solitary 6 years. The prisoners met every day between the visits of their gaolers. Faria showed Dantes the products of his industry and ingenuity, his books, written on the linen of shirts, his fishbone pens and needles, knives, and matches, all accomplished secretly, and beguiled much of the weariness of confinement by educating Dantes in the sciences, history, and languages. Dantes possessed a prodigious memory, combined with readiness of conception, and his studies progressed rapidly. Soon Dantes told the abbé his story, and the abbé had little difficulty in opening the eyes of the astonished Dantes to the villainy of his supposed friends and the deputy procurer. Thus was instilled into his heart a new passion, vengeance. To the cemetery of the Char sent Tod if more than 7 years passed thus. When coming into the abbé's dungeon one night, Dantes found him stricken with paralysis. His right arm and leg remained paralyzed after the seizure. When Dantes next visited him, the abbé showed him a paper, half burnt, and rolled in a cylinder. "This paper," said Faria, "is my treasure, and if I have not been allowed to possess it, you will. Who knows if another attack may not come, and all be finished." The abbé had been secretary to the last of the Counts of Spada, one of the most powerful families of medieval Italy, and he, dying in poverty, had left Faria an old breviary, which had been in the family since the days of the Borgias. In this, by chance, Faria found a piece of yellowed paper, on which, when put in the fire, writing began to appear. From the remains of the paper he made out during the early days of his imprisonment, that a Cardinal Spada, at the end of the 15th century, fearing poisoning at the hands of Pope Alexander VI, had buried in the island of Monte Cristo, a rock between Corsica and Elba, all his ingots, gold, money, and jewels, amounting then to nearly 2 million Roman crowns. "The last Count of Spada made me his heir," said the abbé. "The treasure now amounts to nearly 13 millions of money." The abbé remained paralyzed, and had given up all hope of enjoying the treasure himself, and presently another seizure took him, and one night Dantes was alone with the corpse. Next morning the preparations for burying the dead man were made, the body being placed in a sack and left in the cell till the evening. Dantes came into the cell again. "Ah," he muttered. "Since the dead leave this dungeon, let me assume the place of the dead." Opening the sack, he took out the dead body of his friend, and dragged it through the tunnel to his own cell. Placing it on his own bed, he covered it with the rags he wore himself. Then he sewed himself in the sack with one of the abbé's needles. In his hand he held the dead man's knife, and with palpitating heart awaited events. Slowly the hours dragged on, until at length he heard the heavy footsteps of the gaolers descending to the cell. They lifted the sack, and carried him on a bier through the castle passages, until they came to a door, which was opened. On passing through this, the noise of the waves was heard as they dashed on the rocks below. Then Dantes felt that they took him by the head and by the heels, and flung him into the sea, into whose depths he was dragged by a 36-pound shot tied to his feet. The sea is the cemetery of Chateau d'If. Although giddy, and almost suffocated, he had yet sufficient presence of mind to hold his breath, and as his right hand held his knife, he rapidly ripped up the sack, extricated his arm, and then, by a desperate effort, severed the cord that bound his legs at the moment he was suffocating. With a vigorous spring he rose to the surface, paused to breathe, and then dived again, in order to avoid being seen. When he rose again, he struck boldly out to sea, and, fortunately, was picked up by a sailing vessel. Now at liberty, 14 years after his arrest, he renewed an oath of implacable vengeance against Danglars, Fernand, and Villefort. Nor was it long before he had discovered the secret cave in the island of Monte Cristo, with all its dazzling wealth, as the Abbé Faria had truly foretold. He now stood possessed of such means of vengeance as never in his wildest dreams had any innocent prisoner hoped to be able to command. Vengeance begins some 2 years later. Caspar Cadaris, the keeper of an inn near Beaucaire, was lounging listlessly at his door, when a traveller on horseback dismounted at his door and entered. The visitor Monte Cristo gave the name of Abbé Bissoni, and astonished Cadaris by showing a minute knowledge of his earlier history. The abbé explained that he had been present at the death of Edmond Dantès in prison, and said that even in his dying moments the prisoner had protested he was utterly ignorant of the cause of his imprisonment. "And so he was," exclaimed Cadaris. "How should he have been otherwise?" The abbé had heard of the death of Edmond's aged father, and now he was told the old man had died of starvation. "Thus heaven recompenses virtue," said Cadaris. "I am in destitution and shall die of hunger, as old Dantès did, whilst Fernand and Danglars roll in wealth. All their malpractices have turned to luck. Danglars speculated and made a fortune. He is a millionaire, and now Count Danglars. Fernand played traitor at the Battle of Ligny, and that served for his recommendation to the Bourbons. Afterwards he became Count de Morcerf, and got a considerable sum by the betrayal of Ali Pasha in the Greek War of Independence." The abbé, making an effort, said, "And Mercedes, she disappeared." "Yes, as the sun, to rise next day with more splendor. She is rich, the Countess de Morcerf. She waited 2 hopeless years for Dantès, and yet I am sure she is not happy." "And M. de Villefort?" asked the abbé. "Some time after having arrested Dantès, he married and left Marseilles, no doubt, but he has been as lucky as the rest." "God may seem sometimes to forget for a time," said the abbé, "while his justice reposes, but there always comes a moment when he remembers." Early in 1838 a certain Count of Monte Cristo became a great figure in the life of Paris. His name awakened thoughts of romance and dazzling wealth in the minds of all. It was Albert, the son of the Count de Morcerf, who first introduced the Count of Monte Cristo to the high society of Paris. They had become acquainted at Rome, where Monte Cristo had been able to render a great service to the Viscount Albert de Morcerf and his friend, the Baron Franz d'Épinay. All sorts of stories were afloat in Paris as to the history of this Count of Monte Cristo. When he went to the opera he was accompanied by a beautiful Greek girl, named Haydée, whose guardian he was. But nothing ruffled Monte Cristo. Calmness and deliberation marked all his movements. In some respects he was more like a machine than a human being. Everything he said he would do was done precisely. And now the schemes he had long studied in secret he had begun to carry through as certainly and relentlessly as fate. M. de Villefort, now Procureur du Roi, had a daughter by his first wife, for he had married a second time. Her name was Valentine, and at the command of her father, but not by her own wish, she was engaged to the Baron Franz d'Épinay. She loved a young military officer named Maximilian Morel, a son of the Marseilles shipowner. But neither of them had dared to avow their affection for each other to Valentine's father. Meanwhile, the tide of fortune seemed to have turned with Baron Danglars. His business had suffered many losses, but his greatest loss of all was due to some false news about the price of shares which had been telegraphed to Paris by means which Monte Cristo could have explained. The Baron's daughter was engaged to Albert de Morcerf, but the Count of Morcerf had now come under a cloud, for his betrayal of Ali Pasha had been made public, and perhaps the Count of Monte Cristo could have told how the truth came out at last. So the Baron did not hesitate to break the engagement, and to accept as the suitor for his daughter a dashing young man known as Count Cavalcanti, who had been introduced to Paris by Monte Cristo, but concerning whose antecedents nothing seemed to be known. The Count de Morcerf was tried for his betrayal of Ali, and seemed likely to be acquitted, when a veiled woman was brought to the place of trial, and testified before the committee that she was the daughter of Ali Pasha, and that Morcerf had not only betrayed her father to the Turks, but had sold her and her mother into slavery. The veiled woman was Haydée, the ward of Monte Cristo. The Count was now a ruined man, and when his son Albert discovered the part that Monte Cristo had played, he publicly insulted the Count at the opera. A duel was averted, for Albert publicly apologized to the Count when he learned the reasons for his actions. Furious that he had not been avenged by his son, Morcerf rushed to the house of Monte Cristo. "I came to tell you," said Morcerf, "that as the young people of the present day will not fight, it remains for us to do it." "So much the better," said Monte Cristo. "Are you prepared?" "Yes, sir, and witnesses are unnecessary, as we know each other so little." "Truly they are unnecessary," said Monte Cristo, "but for the reason that we know each other well,